Okay, I really am out of breath. I want to read something, what I want to talk about tonight. And a couple of you have, I think, heard this maybe before, because I spoke at the union and I talked about the same thing. But it's something that comes up from time to time, just in life, when I counsel with people, sometimes in conversations, relatives, just people. And it's this, I would say it is perhaps, if not one of the main things that I encounter when I talk to people, that if there's something that is keeping them from being open to the gospel, it's this issue a lot of times. Now, sometimes they just throw it out there, it's a smokescreen, but sometimes I think it's legit. And my goal, when I sense that it is legit, is to try to address it as best I can. And so I would like to talk about it because I suspect that many, if not all of you, have encountered this same question in people's minds. And maybe, you might have great ways of answering it. I don't know if there is one perfect answer to it, and that's actually one of the points of what I'm going to talk about tonight. But I'm just going to kind of random, it's not random, but stream of consciousness, just talk about it a little bit. And it's the problem of evil. Or pain and suffering, evil, pain, suffering. It's the old, if there's this good, all-powerful God, why does he let this stuff happen? And there's a book, there's a few books that talk about this, but one of them is The Case for Faith by a guy named Lee Strobel, who was, before he got saved, he was an investigative journalist. A lot of you are probably familiar with him. Worked for the Chicago something, whatever that, Tribune, is that their big paper? Yeah. And he did that for several years, and then something happened. I don't remember what it was. Did his wife get saved? Was that what happened? Anybody know?
Yeah, his wife was a Christian, and she challenged him to investigate it like he would any other case.
Yeah, and he did that, and then he wound up getting saved. So yeah, I think his wife came to faith before he did. So anyway, and so he's written this book, and what he does is he takes some of these big objections that people have, and he goes around and he talks to, quote, experts on the subject, and he has these interviews, and it's really a good read. It's a good book if you haven't read it. But his first chapter is this problem, because it's such a big one. And he has a couple quotes in the beginning of the chapter, and I just wanted to read them. It kind of sets the issue. One is by Epicurus, a Greek philosopher from a long, long time ago. People have been thinking about this for thousands of years. And this is what Epicurus said. He said it in Greek, but I'm going to read the English so you'll understand. Yes. Either God wants to abolish evil and cannot, or he can abolish evil but does not want to. Or he cannot abolish evil and does not want to abolish evil. If he wants to abolish evil but cannot, he is impotent. If he can abolish evil and does not want to, then he is wicked. But if God both can and wants to abolish evil, then how comes evil in the world? Why do we have evil? And then John Stott, a British theologian, more recently said, the fact of suffering undoubtedly constitutes the single greatest challenge to the Christian faith and has been in every generation. Its distribution, suffering's distribution and degree, appear to be entirely random and therefore unfair. Sensitive spirits ask if it can possibly be reconciled with God's justice and love. And so that kind of sets it a little bit, sets the issue. In this same book, one of the things that he did, one of the first people he talked to was a guy named Charles Templeton. And that's a name that maybe you know, maybe you don't. Templeton was a contemporary and actually a good friend of Billy Graham. When they were young, they were both preachers. Templeton was actually, by a lot of people, felt that he was a better preacher. He certainly got a lot of crowds. Very good speaker. And he and Billy Graham traveled around and did some things together, and were good friends. And Templeton, Strobel went and interviewed him, obviously, at the time of the interview. Templeton was now an old man. Templeton walked away from the faith. He quit preaching, and it was because of this issue, this issue of pain and suffering and evil in the world. And Templeton concluded that there could not be a loving God. Could not. It was impossible that there would be a loving God given the extent of evil and pain and suffering in the world. And so Strobel wanted to talk to him about that, and Templeton granted him an interview. So I just want to read a little excerpt from the interview. This is Strobel talking in the first person. Was there one thing in particular that caused you to lose your faith in God? I asked at the outset. He thought for a moment, Templeton thought for a moment. It was a photograph in Life magazine, he said finally. Really, I said, a photograph? How so? He narrowed his eyes a bit and looked off to the side, as if he were viewing the photo afresh and reliving the moment. It was a picture of a black woman in northern Africa, he explained. They were experiencing a devastating drought, and she was holding her dead baby in her arms and looking up to heaven with the most forlorn expression. I looked at it and I thought, is it possible to believe that there is a loving or caring creator when all this woman needed was rain? As he emphasized the word rain, his bushy gray eyebrows shot up and his arms gestured toward heaven as if beckoning for a response. How could a loving God do this to that woman? He implored as he got more animated, moving to the edge of his chair. Who runs the rain? I don't, you don't, he does. Or that's what I thought. But when I saw that photograph, I immediately knew it is not possible for this to happen and for there to be a loving God. There was no way. Who else but a fiend could destroy a baby and virtually kill its mother with agony when all that was needed was rain? He paused, letting the question hang heavily in the air, then settled back into his chair. That was the climactic moment, he said. And then I began to think further about the world being the creation of God. I started considering the plagues that sweep across parts of the planet and indiscriminately kill, more often than not, painfully, all kinds of people, the ordinary, the decent, and the rotten. And it just became crystal clear to me that it is not possible for an intelligent person to believe that there is a deity who loves. So, thus spake Charles Templeton. So I want to talk about this, but kind of before I do, initially, I think it's something that's important to just kind of address quickly at the outset. And that is this, and some of you have already maybe thought of this or have read this or thought in this way, but this objection comes up many, many times. At least I've heard it many, many times. And it's always struck me, not always, but I'd say the last 20, 30 years, it's struck me every time it comes up. People don't think of it this way, but to me, the presence of evil in the world, this objection that there's evil in the world, is actually, I think it's an apologetic for God. Not against God's existence, but it's in favor of God's existence. Why do I say that? Well, why do we object against evil in the first place? The very fact that we do, that we have this objection, indicates that in my mind, as I'm objecting, I must have some standard for good, the opposite of evil. And it has to be something that's above me. It can't just be, I don't like it. Because if all I can say is, I don't like the way the world is, I begin to sound like a petulant child. If that's all I can say is, I just don't like it. So it has to be something bigger than me, something that transcends me, that transcends you. And that is in fact what people are saying when they object to the problem of evil, that there is an objective standard of some sort that's out there, that it doesn't matter what you like or what I like, it's just wrong, it's just not fair. The way the world is, it's broken. C.S. Lewis, who so often says good things, said this: a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. And then Lewis went on, he was talking about his old days when he made this objection, and Lewis says, what was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If I didn't have an idea of a straight line, how could I call it crooked? If I didn't have an idea of what perfect justice and fairness is, how could I say that this universe is unfair? And so he kind of caught himself in his younger days when he was making this objection, because if I don't have a standard that's perfect, that's above you and I'm just talking about preference, my moral preferences. That's all I'm talking about. I like vanilla, you like chocolate. I like to save people, Hitler likes to kill them. That's all it is. I just like it this way, and it's not this way, and doggone it, it should be. But that's not what people are saying. They're saying it ought not be this way. So they're making a legitimate, objective objection of some kind. And if you're a moral relativist, you can't do that. You have to have some source of that standard. And if it's just you and what you think, that's not good enough. Because then, so what? I mean, it's the grand so what? If you say, I don't like it, so what? I mean, what makes your idea any better than my idea? So there has to be an appeal to a higher authority of some kind. So to me, this whole objection actually indicates that perhaps there is a God, because when you look to the source for that standard that you're using, that straight line, it kind of starts to look like something very much like God, where that would have to come from. So anyway, that's just an initial thing. So the problem, here's the problem as a Christian. As a Christian, I believe this. I believe, number one, God exists. All right? Number two, I do believe that God is all good. I believe God is all powerful. And I also believe God is all wise, all knowing. And it's very clear to me, number five, that evil does exist. So there's the problem. How can those all be true? You know, you can build yourself a little syllogism of sorts where it says, okay, if God is good, he would want to do away with evil. If God was powerful, all powerful, he could do away with evil. And yet here we look around and we see evil all over the place. Therefore, God must not be all good and all powerful. Maybe he's one, maybe he's neither, but he can't be both. Else, why would we have evil in the world? I want to talk about that and those different premises. But before I do, I keep saying before I do, I think it's maybe helpful to talk, and it will be later, to talk about what evil actually is. I remember years ago I was in college, and I had a professor well, actually, I didn't have the professor. There was a professor. I talked to him. I knew him, but I never actually took his class. But a lot of my friends did. And he had this thing that he would do in class. He taught a comparative religion class. And he would try, and it was usually successful, and he would just stump freshmen that would take this class. And basically he would ask them, okay, is God all powerful? Is God the creator? Did everything come from God? And so God created everything. And if God created everything, therefore God must have created evil. And yet God's not evil, and he has nothing to do with evil. So how could he have created evil? And it was, well, he didn't create evil. Well, did somebody else create evil? I mean, you know, where did evil come from if everything comes from God? Which most of us, now that we're older and wiser, we see right through that. But the problem in that statement is it assumes that evil is something. It is a something. That it has some status of being. And I think it's important to identify what evil is and what it is not. What kind of thing is it? Or is it even a thing at all? And I would submit that it's not a thing at all. Is cold a thing? Cold is not a thing. I feel cold, but when we talk about being cold, it's not a thing in and of itself. Cold is simply the absence of another thing, which can be measured, and that's heat. Heat is actually a thing, it's energy. Cold is not. You don't have cold energy. You can't add cold to something. You can only get something so cold. Anybody know what it is? Absolute zero? Just out of curiosity? It's just under 400, or just above, 460 degrees Fahrenheit, negative 460 degrees Fahrenheit. It's 459 point something. I don't remember what it is. Anyway, that's as cold as you can get. You can't get any colder than that, because at that point, atoms stop moving. All heat energy has been removed. So you can't add more cold. Cold is not a thing. It's the absence of heat. Same thing with darkness. You can't add darkness. I mean, authors talk about the inky darkness grew blacker, you know, but all they're saying is you removed light. You just removed more light. Light is a measurable, quantifiable source. It's an energy. Dark is not an energy, all right? You don't have more darkness. Once you achieve absolute absence of light, you can't make it any darker than that. Well, evil is a thing like that. It's a thing that's not a thing. It's the absence of good. That's what evil is. It's the absence of good. So if that's true, it's very important then how I define good. And I go back to what I said before. Is it some objective definition that we can all agree on, or is it just your preference and my preference? But to say that God somehow, you know, created evil, that's silly, because evil isn't a thing. It's like God didn't create cold, he didn't create dark. He created light and heat, but not cold, not dark, and not evil. It's not, you know, evil isn't some black gooey substance. There was a Spider-Man movie a few years ago that they made that Spider-Man got some kind of black gooey thing on him that made him really evil. Anybody remember what I'm talking about? Anyway, that's not what evil's like, okay? That's not evil at all. It's not a black gooey substance. What evil is, it's basically a result of of a departure from a standard of good, of moral goodness. And the way that you depart from that standard is by making choices. So if you want to blame somebody for creating evil, it's us, it's Satan, it's the angels that fell. That's where evil comes from. But even that, it's not something that we created. It's just a choice that departs from the standard of good. That's what evil is. So, don't get confused by that, the way people talk about it sometimes. Okay, so these different attributes of God that come into play. If God's all-powerful, then God could obviously do away with evil if he was all-powerful. That's one of the premises. Well, what does that mean? Can God do everything? If God's all-powerful, does that mean he can do everything? There's nothing that God can't do if he's all-powerful. Is that right? And the answer is no. That's absolute nonsense. God cannot create a married bachelor. He can't do it. It's nonsensical. God cannot create a square circle. It's nonsensical. He can't do it. That's not a limitation on his power. That's just a limitation on logic. You're submitting something that doesn't make sense. He can't do that. Okay, if that's true, that concept I think is really important, because there's another thing that God can't do because it doesn't make sense. He can't make human beings, because human beings are what? Human beings are creatures that are made in the image of God. He can't do that, and all that goes into having the image of God, including the ability to some degree at least, self-determine, free will, to make choices. You can't create somebody and give them that without giving them the ability to choose and depart from the standard of good. Does that make sense? So there's the capacity for evil. You can't create human beings being what human beings are. He couldn't create human beings without giving them the ability to choose to depart from the standard of good and evil. Because if they couldn't choose to depart from the standard, they wouldn't be human beings. They'd be something else. Robots, some kind of animal, I don't know. But that's built in to humanity. It's a necessary component of being a human being made in the image of God, this component of free will. Now, you can ask the question, and it's a fair question to ask. You can ask, was it worth it for God to do that? Why did you do that, God? Why not create a world without free will? Well, I don't know why. I have an idea, and here's my idea. You take it for what it's worth. One of the things that is so obviously important to God when you read his word is love. He loves love. It's really important to him. He says a lot of things about it. He says he's light and some other things too, but the thing that he says about himself, it seems with the most frequency and seriousness, is that he is love. And he continually describes himself as love. That's what he values apparently very, very highly. It's a huge component of who he is. Okay. If he wants there to be love, there has to be choice. Love requires a choice. I think that's why he created us the way he did, because he knew that if he didn't, there wouldn't be the ability to love. Love is the thing that he places the highest value on, but love is absolutely a choice. Just think, what if you, or what if I'll use myself for an example, what if I could do some sort of Jedi mind trick control, on my family, on my wife, and on my kids. These are not the droids you are looking for. This is not the dinner you wish to serve me tonight. You were to serve me steak. What if I could do all kinds of, Jedi mind tricks and get them so that anytime any of them had the opportunity even to do something selfish or unkind or hurtful or disrespectful, or that showed anything but, great estimation of who I am, anytime they had a chance to do that, I stopped them from doing it with my Jedi mind trick. I stopped them from even thinking the thought of doing that. All they could do would be to look at me and give me steak and say, gee, you're great. It's, what if I could do that? This is dumb, it just flashed into my head. There's a Far Side cartoon. And it's the difference between a cat and a dog. And one frame shows a dog looking up, and there's a hand coming down, petting the dog's head. And the dog is thinking, this feels so wonderful. You must be some kind of god. And then it's a split frame, and the other side it's the cat. Same thing. There's a hand scratching the cat's head, and the cat's thinking, "This feels so wonderful. I must be some kind of god." And it's if I could do that Jedi mind trick thing, I mean, it sounds weird because I like dogs, but my kids and my wife would be nothing more than dogs. I mean, they would just, yes, master. And they would be anything but human. Could I say that they loved me? No, I couldn't. Because they didn't have a choice. I mean, even a dog has a choice. I mean, if a master beats the dog can run away. I couldn't say in any stretch of the imagination that they loved me because they didn't have a choice. And we all know that. We all say, well, of course, that's a no-brainer, Tad. But that's the situation that would have existed with respect to us if God had not created us with the ability to choose and to make a choice to depart from good and to choose evil. We wouldn't have had a choice. If we have no choice, we couldn't love either. And so we would live in a vastly different world. And love is very, very important to God. So we would not be human without this capacity. So this doesn't limit God's power at all. It's just this idea that God's all-powerful, then why doesn't he destroy evil? Because evil is woven into the fabric of who he decided us to be in his wisdom and in his sovereignty and in his desire to have love. And apparently it was worth it. And really, he's the only one who could say. I can't say. I can't put myself in his shoes and decide if it's worth it or not. I have no idea, but apparently it was. When we had kids, before we had kids, well, we didn't think we were going to have 6 kids, but we figured, we'll have Kay wanted 2, I wanted 4. So she got her 2, I got my 4. But it was a little bit of an exercise, and you know this if you've had kids, it was kind of an exercise in faith to have kids, is it not? Because you don't know what the world holds, you don't know what the future holds. We were very aware that our kids could reject God, could turn away from him, could never know him, spend eternity without him in hell. We knew that, and it broke our hearts to think that. And it was a risk. But we gladly took it. And people, I've talked about this with people sometimes, and it's hard to explain. But we just sense that we have a really good thing going here with Kay and I. We really love each other. We know that we do. We know we're not going to split up ever. Even if we hate each other's guts, we're not going to split because God's part of the equation. It's that threefold cord. And not only do we love each other, he loves us. And he's invited us into this relationship with him. Tim Keller writes a book called The Reason for God, and he calls it the dance. Like in the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. There's like this 3-man weave in a basketball drill, that one's in the center, and then the others are in the center, and then the other one, and then the other one. And he's invited us into that dance with him. And we just thought, how could they not join? They'll see how good it is. Of course they'll want to join. And so it was worth the risk to us, even though we knew that maybe 1 or 2 or 3, would not. So far, I guess the jury's still out, but so far we're real grateful because they all seem to be joining the dance. But so I have to believe that God is the only one who knows if it was worth it or not, and he decided to do it. And I kind of get it, because even me in my limited inability to see the future, which was probably a blessing, we thought it was worth it, and we had kids, so anyway. So this all-powerful thing, I do not think in any way that because God is all-powerful that he would destroy evil. Because if he destroyed evil, what would he have to do? Destroy us. He'd have to destroy us because we're the agents that create, in quote marks, evil by making those choices. And that's not his plan. It never was. Okay, so this idea that God is all-knowing, this is an important part of the equation too. If God's all-knowing, then he is much greater than you and I, because he not only knows the past like we do, although he knows it way more perfectly, he knows the present way more perfectly, but he also knows the future, and that's the difference. And we know he knows the future. He's shown us because of prophecy. He's told us, I am the Lord, I speak the end from the beginning. No other holy book does that. No other holy book has this record of prophecy in it. So I have to admit, as just an intellectually honest human being, I have to admit that if that's true, if he speaks and knows the future, at least it's possible, it is at least possible that he could look ahead at the future and see evil, and he could perhaps deliberately tolerate horrible things because he foresees some greater good happening in the long run. that I can't see. I have no idea because I don't see the future. It's at least possible. This is a big deal because this huge difference between God and me, this is why how do I say this? If I see somebody in great distress, they're about to die, get hit by a bus, they're starving, whatever, I would be morally obliged to do whatever I could do to help them. In a way that perhaps God is not. Because I don't know what's going to happen in the future. All I know is right now. And right now I know that person's in distress. I want to help them because I want to have mercy. I want to have compassion. I have no idea. If I would have been in Germany in, I got to do the math here. Let's say that around 1910, I'm guessing, and I would have been walking down the streets of Germany, and if there would have been a little boy walking across the street and a big truck was about to hit him and run him over, I would have, I think, dashed out into the street, perhaps risking my own life, to grab that little boy and snatch him away from that truck so that truck didn't hit him, okay? Because that's the right thing to do. Now, if I was to have gone back in time traveled and gone back to 1910, and I saw that little boy, and I was at the side of the street, and I had the chance to run out and grab him and snatch him, but I knew his name was Adolf Hitler, I don't know what I would have done. I might not have grabbed him. I think I probably wouldn't have, to be honest. I don't know. I don't know what I would have done. God would just give me the grace to know what to do. But you see the dilemma? You see why I wouldn't have. And I doubt many of you would strongly condemn me for not grabbing him. Because Adolf Hitler was responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people. More than anyone in the 20th century, with the possible exception of Stalin and Mao Zedong. Hitler probably the greatest, and most people would say the most evil murderer, in the history of the 20th century. So there's a moral dilemma there if I know the future. But because I don't know the future, I run to save little kids if I can. And so it's a lot easier, in a sense, to be a person, a human being, than it is to be God. So the fact that God doesn't rush in and save everybody from all the bad things that happen, whereas if I was watching and had the power to save them, I would, that doesn't mean I'm better than God. It means God has a whole bunch more complicated knowledge on his plate than I could ever dream of having. And I'm willing to cut him some slack, because every time I see what he's done, it always demonstrates compassion, and it seems to me that it's always good, at least from a certain perspective, where I don't have that. It's all might, or maybe to me, the future. So here's, we know this is true. We know that really bad things oftentimes do produce really good things. I mean, you could argue perhaps one of the worst things that ever happened in the history of the world was the murder of God, and look at the good that came from it. And so this idea that, great evil can produce great good in the long run, it should not be a foreign idea to us. So anyway, I'm willing, because he's all-knowing, I'm willing to cut him some slack and not hold him to the same standards as what I would do, because that doesn't define what's good, because I have limited knowledge of the future. Okay, the other thing, God is all good. If God was all good, then he would want to eliminate evil. He would want to get rid of evil if he was all good. There would be no room for evil. Well, good is a tricky word. It's a really tricky word. It can mean a lot of things. Is it good to relieve someone of pain? Is it bad to allow pain or even to purposefully inflict pain? At first blush, you say, well, yeah, probably. Well, not necessarily. What about dentists? What about coaches? What about parents? I've inflicted a lot of pain on my children. Now, it's usually to one specific area of their body when they're young, but a lot of pain and even tears have been produced directly and purposefully by me. But it's for something greater. It's a greater good down the road. And we always have talked to our kids, and we explain, and they say they understand. Whether they do or not, I don't know, when they're young. But, I will, if you're acting like a complete rebellious jerk and defying your mother, I will spank you, because I do not want you to grow up and lose every job you've ever had because you've established a pattern of defying the authority in your life just because you don't respect them at that moment. I don't want you to, do that to God. we don't spank them for being stupid, but if you do stupid things, there are going to be some consequences, because guess what? I don't want you to grow up and have no friends because nobody wants to hang around you because you're a stupid, idiotic jerk that always thinks of themselves. So there's a greater good I'm shooting for here, and I'm doing it by inflicting either emotional or physical pain. So this idea is not foreign. My gosh, in the track season, I'm a track coach. I give my hurdlers the dry heaves, on their workouts sometimes. I inflict a lot of pain. I mean, I've had kids throw up on me. Not on me literally, but but boy, I'll tell you, the last weekend in May, they're thankful when they get first or second or third or fourth or whatever they get in state. They're very thankful. And so this idea that it's good to relieve pain and it's bad to inflict pain, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Good does not mean the absence of pain. Suffering is not necessarily a bad thing. Pain is not necessarily a bad thing. Parents know that. Coaches know that. It's sometimes to be good is not to be nice. They're not the same. Nice does not equal good all the time. Who was it that said, oh shoot, I can't remember who it was. I always want to say it's C.S. Lewis because I read him a lot, but I don't think this was. Oh, it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer that said this. I'm paraphrasing, but he said, there is, I'm totally paraphrasing, but there's no mercy so great as the mercy that speaks in rebuke to a brother caught up in a sin. And there's no, what's the word he used? I think hatred. I think he said there's no hatred so great as the false love that will say nothing when you see your brother overtaken in a sin. That's a big paraphrase. That's not how he said it exactly, but that's the idea. So to inflict some kind of pain is not necessarily, and to be nice is not the same thing as being good. Here's the thing. What's the point of life? If the point of life is to avoid suffering, as some suggest, like Sam Harris. Sam Harris wrote a book called Letter to a Christian Nation. I do not recommend you read it unless you like reading what the other side says, just so you can see, where the holes are, which I like to do. But he wrote this book, and it's just full of logical, just fallacy after fallacy. But one of the things that he objects, obviously, to this problem of suffering, and he says, basically, he defines good as the alleviation of the most suffering you can for people. And that's essentially his idea of what the point of life is to avoid suffering. That's the greatest good. That's what he says in this book. That is not God's idea of the greatest good. God's idea of the greatest good in life is to prepare you for eternity. That's what God's trying to do to you and I, is to prepare us for eternity, not to be nice or give us even, the easiest, most pain-free life that we can. Because he makes it very clear in his word. Paul says in Romans 5 that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope will not make you ashamed. This is a principle you see in Scripture all the time, and boy, do we forget this in America. We think, if God allows me to suffer in any way, if God doesn't let me get what I want, doesn't let me express my sexuality how I interpret it, or doesn't give me the person I want to marry, if he denies me of any of these things, the job I want, whatever, then he's abandoned me, or he is somehow cruel. Well, what kind of person thinks like that? A 3-year-old thinks like that. Doesn't it? I mean, I'm serious. I've had a lot of 3-year-olds. That's essentially how a 3 to 6-year-old thinks. Is, if I don't get what I want, if they don't give me what I want, they're cruel, they've abandoned me, whatever. And this is how we tend to think. Now, I'm not trying to minimize, I don't mean to minimize difficulties that we go through. We go through really hard things, but the principle is still the same. If I'm not getting what I want, have I assumed that God abandons me or that he's cruel? And it's really interesting to me, if that's true, if God's desire for us is to be prepared for eternity, which I think Scripture is very clear that is, consider this. When do people seem to come to God? In times of relative ease or in times of relative suffering? We all know it's times of suffering. When did the nation of Israel call out to God and turn to God? When things were going great? No, that's when they slipped into idolatry. When things were going terrible is when they called out. And God would specifically use nations to come in so they would call out. And if it's true that this life is just preparation for eternity, then can we see that anything that gets us to repent and to call out to God and to turn to God, that is a good thing. Or at least it has the potential for a much greater good than just the relief of suffering in our lives. If that is true, if that idea is true, and I think Scripture is pretty clear that it is, our suffering is just a drop in the bucket compared to eternity. And the Scripture tells us this clearly in 2 Corinthians 4, 16 through 18. Therefore, we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is, this is Paul writing this. This is a guy that got beat up and left for dead and shipwrecked, and these terrible things happened to him. Our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. You see what he's saying? It's all about eternity. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. And he's saying, how can we even compare these things? They're not worthy to be compared. Romans 18, he says just that. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. So he's saying, look down the road. Get on the same page as what the Father's plan is. So when we go back and we look at these 5 things, God exists. Christians believe God exists. He's all good. He's all powerful. He's all wise. And yet evil exists. They don't contradict. They do not necessarily contradict at all. God can be all those things and still allow evil and pain to exist because he can take it and he can use it for good. And he's done it time and time again. I think of what Charles Templeton said, the thing I read in the beginning, that it was impossible for there to believe that there is a loving God in light of the evil we see in the world. He said an intelligent person cannot possibly believe that. Nothing against Templeton, I don't even know him. But I will have to confess, this seems to me to be at best presumptuous and at worst just incredibly arrogant to say that. Because he's putting himself in the position of God and he's saying, even though I don't see the future, I don't have all knowledge or any of these things, I can still say categorically it's true, that it's impossible to believe this. And I just don't see how a finite human being can put him or herself in the shoes of someone with infinite wisdom and say that, oh, it's not possible to tolerate short-term evil for a long-term good. I just don't even see how you can really say that. We just don't have the capacity. In this book, he talks to another guy named Peter Kreeft, philosopher, professor guy. And Kreeft gives this example of, he says, okay, look at the difference between you and God. It's a pretty vast difference, I mean, intellectually. Is that difference greater than the difference between you and a bear? And I would say, without question, absolutely. God knows much more. The difference between what I know and God knows is much greater than the difference between what I know and a bear knows. And Kreeft, would agree with that. And so he says, okay, if that's true, here's a scenario. A bear's caught in a trap in the woods, and here comes a guy, a hunter, with a gun. The bear sees this. The bear freaks out. The bear knows this guy's going to shoot him. He's going to kill him. So the bear tries to get away, pulls. He makes the trap dig deeper into his leg. The bear's freaking out, crazed with pain, crazed with fear, because he knows this hunter's going to get him. Well, what he doesn't know, because he's a bear, is it's not a hunter at all. It's a DNR guy or fish and wildlife guy. And it's not a gun with bullets, it's a gun with tranquilizers. And the guy just wants to shoot him with a tranquilizer so the bear will go to sleep so he can push the leg into the trap to release the trap so he can help the bear. Well, the bear has no idea. The bear, reasonably to a bear, assumes man with gun, bad news, wants to kill me. I have to do everything I can to get away. And Kreft's point is, this is exactly what we're like with God. We're like the bear. We just assume that he's evil, he's cruel, he's heartless, and he's abandoned us, and we have no idea. We have no idea because we can't look at his perspective. We're looking at it from our perspective, which is very finite. It seems to me, as is often the case, C.S. Lewis got it right about pain and suffering. He has a quote from The Problem of Pain. He says, we can ignore even pleasure, but pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And what is it that God is using pain to rouse us to? The only answer that makes sense to me, and it makes so much sense to me, is that pain and suffering, evil, if you will, are a constant reminder that all is not as it should be. It's broken, and that we need him. We need him. That's That's what pain and suffering and evil are a reminder of. That's the good, I think, that can come out of evil, is the realization that we need God. And here's the thing, we need Him more than we need answers. I mean, everything I've been talking about so far is kind of philosophical, explaining the problem of evil. But that's ultimately not even what we need. We don't need answers. What we need is God. We need Him. We need Himself. Job learned this. Job, even atheistic people, secular people say that Job is perhaps the greatest work ever done on the problem of pain and suffering. And I think in large part, a lot of what they say is, the conversations with the friends. But to me, it's the last part of the book. It's the last 5 chapters of the book of Job where it really comes to a head. Because that's where, after all his friends have said, well, it's because you've done this and this and this, and Job says, no, I plead my case. I want to stand before God. And Elihu comes in, the 4th friend, and he says some good things. And then God shows up at the end. In the last 5 chapters, God shows up in the whirlwind. And he comes to him, and basically God shows up and he says, who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? And he says, prepare yourself and answer me like a man. He says, prepare yourself like a man, I will question you, and you answer me. And then God basically goes off, and for the next 2 or 3 chapters, reviews for Job the fact that God is God and Job is not. Where were you? Were you here when I did this? Were you here when I did this? And he just reminds him of the immensity of who he is. That's what he does for a couple chapters there. And then if you look at Job's replies, to me, that's the value of the book. In Job chapter 40, he has a couple replies. They're both very short. In chapter 40, this is Job's first reply after God's said, were you there when I did this, when I did this? Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further. Then God goes on and says, okay, get ready. Now I want you to answer me. And he goes on and he tells him more stuff about, I'm God. I've done this and this and this. And then Job's second answer in chapter 42. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You will and can and will do whatever you want to do. You asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Job's going back to what God asked him in the beginning, what he said in the beginning. You said, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand. All these objections I had. Things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. I did not have the knowledge that you have. I did not have the perspective that you have, God. I spoke without knowing. Listen, please, and let me speak, Job says. You said, I will question you, and you shall answer me. He's reminding God of what God told him. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. Those 2 verses there, to me, encapsulate the book of Job. He says, you said to answer you. Here's my answer. I have heard of you by my ear before. I've heard about you. I know about you. People talk about you. I've heard of you, but now my eye sees you. And to me, that is so clear. What Job is saying is, all these objections that I had, because he kept asking his friends, why? It's not right. Why? I'm without sin. I'm righteous man. And he's not asking why anymore. He's not looking for a reason for all this happening. He says, I've heard about you, and I think included in that is probably, things like your ways, but now I see you. And that's all he needs. That's all he needs. And so it's the desire for that pain and suffering, I think, produce. And we spend a lot of time looking for the answers. Why did this happen? Why did this happen? And as C.S. Lewis says, it's a megaphone, and the megaphone, because God is shouting, what you need is me. Because when he showed up to Job, he didn't say, well, here's why I did this, Job, blah, 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 blah. He just said, do you know who I am? Do you know who I am? This is who I am, Job. And Job said, I shut my mouth. And he said, I have heard of you, but now I see you. Now I know you in a way I did not know before. You are enough. And Job stopped asking questions at that point. And that's what Job realized. That's the good, I think, that as best I can see, that God has purposed it's worth it to allow is that desire for his presence, which causes us to turn to him. And when that happens, we spend an eternity with him, which obviously that's what he wants. He died on the cross for that. So that's the thing. That's what it's designed to get us to. That's what Job realized. God did not let Job suffer because he didn't love him. He let Job suffer because he did love him. And he wanted to be with him for eternity. He wanted Job to come and join the dance. That's why he let him go through that stuff. Job's suffering hollowed out a big space inside of him so God could fill it, not with God's answers, but with God's presence, with him himself. So the answer to this whole problem of evil and pain and suffering, it's not an argument, it's a person. And it's Jesus. And here's the thing. Job got part of the picture. We get the whole picture. We get more than Job got. We get the rest as we look at Jesus. Because Job looked and he saw the God who was high and lifted up, right? Who was mighty, who was holy, who was awesome in power. When we look at Jesus, we see that, but we also see something else. We see the God who suffers with us. Not only is he mighty and awesome in power, but he willingly and voluntarily comes and he suffers with us and he bears our suffering so that we can be with him. We get a more complete picture of who he is. He knows my suffering, he shares my suffering, your suffering, and he does not leave us alone. He does not leave us alone. And that's the answer. He's the answer. He's what we need. We don't need philosophical explanations. We just need him. And that's what it does. It hollows out a space in our life and our heart, so he'll fill it. I'll wrap it up, but I just want to read one thing from this book. Again, it's at the end of this whole discussion about the problem of evil, where he's been talking to this guy, Peter Kreeft. Let's see, it's a few paragraphs, not too long. They've been talking about Job, so they're kind of on the same track that we've been on. We were clearly moving toward the climax of our discussion. This is Strobel and this guy, Peter Kreeft, the philosopher guy. The clues Kreeft had mentioned at the outset of our interview were converging, and I could sense an increasing passion and conviction in his voice. I wanted to see more of his heart, though, and I wouldn't be disappointed. The answer, then, to suffering, I said, in trying to sum up where we've come, is not an answer at all. Correct, he emphasized, leaning forward as he pleaded his case. It's the answerer. It's Jesus himself. It's not a bunch of words. It's the Word. It's not a tightly woven philosophical argument. It's a person, the person. The answer to suffering cannot just be an abstract idea, because this isn't an abstract issue. It's a personal issue. It requires a personal response. The answer must be someone, not just something, because the issue involves someone. God, where are you? That question almost echoed in his small office. It demanded a response. To Kreeft, there is one response, a very real one, a living one. Jesus is there sitting beside us in the lowest places of our lives, he said. Are we broken? He was broken, like bread for us. Are we despised? He was despised and rejected of men. Do we cry out that we can't take any more? He was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Do people betray us? He was sold out himself. Are our tenderest relationships broken? He too loved and was rejected. Do people turn from us? They hid their faces from him as from a leper. Does he descend into all of our hells? Yes, he does. From the depths of a Nazi death camp, Corrie ten Boom wrote, no matter how deep our darkness, he is deeper still. He not only rose from the dead, he changed the meaning of death, and therefore of all the little deaths, the sufferings that anticipate death and make up parts of it. He is gassed in Auschwitz. He is sneered at in Soweto, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. He is mocked in Northern Ireland. He is enslaved in the Sudan. He's the one we love to hate, yet to us, he has chosen to return love. Every tear we shed becomes his tear. He may not wipe them away yet, but he will. He paused, his confident tone downshifting to tentative. In the end, God has only given us partial explanations, he said slowly, a shrug in his voice. Maybe that's because he saw that a better explanation wouldn't have been good for us. I don't know why. As a philosopher, I'm obviously curious. Humanly, I wish he had given us more information. With that, he looked fully into my face. But he knew Jesus was more than an explanation, he said firmly. He is what we really need. If your friend is sick and dying, the most important thing he wants is not an explanation. He wants you to sit with him. He's terrified of being alone more than anything else. So God has not left us alone. Kreft leaned back in his chair and let himself relax. There was only one more thing he wanted me to know. And for that, he said, I love him. So I think all this is worth talking about and thinking about, because each of us, if not in our own lives, know people that are or have or will go through pain, suffering, evil that they see as being unfair. They don't understand why. And I think one of the wonderful things that we can hope to do as ambassadors of Christ is to help them through that so that they can be reconciled to this God who they think, if he does exist, he's cruel and arbitrary and capricious. If we know why we love him, because I love what Chris said. He said, that is why I love him. And there's a lot in that statement. And I would echo that with him. I love him for a lot of reasons. Some of them are pretty shallow. I love him because he saved me. I love him because he's good. But I also love him because the extent to which he stooped to come down and conquer not just death, but pain and suffering, and the extent to which he took that on himself. So I have absolutely no doubt that he, whatever suffering, minimal suffering I've gone through, he knows, and he has shared that with me. And that's a precious thing, I think, that we can bring to other people when they go through, to help them hopefully to see that God isn't letting you go through this because he doesn't love you. He's letting it happen because he does love you. And he went through it himself, by the way. I can't imagine something more... I mean, I've had some physical suffering, migraines for 25 years of my life, but I mean, that pales in comparison to some of you, I know. But the thing that I can't imagine when I think about it, I have thought about it, and it's hard for me to imagine. I used to think about it when I was in really deep dramatic plays. I would think about this sometimes just to create kind of an emotional feel for the play. And that is to watch one of my kids going through excruciating suffering when I had the power to stop it, but I couldn't for some reason. And that, to me, it's not just Jesus who suffered, it's the Father who suffered as well. And I do love him because of that. That's a huge reason why I love him. So I just think it's good for us to think these things through and to know and just to be prepared to give an answer for the hope that's in us. Because that hope, as Paul says, is largely produced by suffering that produces perseverance, that produced character, that produced hope. So that's why I wanted to talk about it.